Well, so we have a full house, and I feel like one of the reasons we have a full house is that private prisons are a real lightning rod. I think they inspire really powerful reactions in people, and I think a lot of people see them as standing for something. And I'm curious what you think they stand for, and what aspects of that you set out to challenge or explore as you decided to write this book.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming tonight. And one of the reasons I wrote this book is that I focus at the Brennan Center on reducing prison populations and reducing mass incarceration. And I look at the incentives that drive and perpetuate more people behind bars. And this idea of profiting off of incarceration has sort of always intrigued me. You know, how did this come about? What does this mean? And in the book, I look at not only the private prison industry, so those are the corporations that own and operate prisons, but the vast prison industrial complex, which is much broader than just these private prison companies. So this is companies like JPay, that people call the Apple of incarceration, that provides email services for a pretty hefty fee, 50 cents per email. $10 for video visitation if someone wants to visit with their family online. Companies that profit off of incarceration, such as healthcare companies, food companies like Airmark. There's really almost no end to the number of companies that do profit off of incarceration. And the book is an inquiry into what does it mean to America that capitalism is such a key part of incarceration. What does it mean that we've delegated so much authority to these private companies to house, care for, clothe those who are behind bars? Is it cheaper? Are we saving taxpayer money? And if we are saving taxpayer dollars, does that validate the industry? What are the moral implications of profiting off of so many people behind bars? And those are the questions that the book sets out to answer, and ultimately finds that these private prison corporations did not cause mass incarceration. Our policies caused mass incarceration. We were going to have mass incarceration with or without these corporations, but they certainly didn't sit idly by, and they were a pretty major player in terms of ensuring that our prison populations were perpetuated and actually were not reduced in this country.
You said a second ago that one of the questions you wanted to answer is whether, if we were to accept the premise that these institutions save taxpayer money, is it worth the moral cost? And I'm curious what you think is at the root of why private prisons and the idea of profiting off of incarceration is so sort of reflexively repugnant to so many people. Like, what is it about it that it just seems so obviously wrong to some people?
That's a great question. And this is an issue that engenders a lot of debate, a lot of emotion. There are divestment campaigns that have taken over universities. Columbia University became the first university in the nation to divest from all private prison corporations. I spoke to undergrads who, in New Haven, who instead of watching the Super Bowl, were actually in a meeting talking about divestment and were preparing their divestment campaign. This issue really engenders a lot of debate. And part of why people get so emotional and passionate about this issue is that we are making so much money off of the people who are behind bars. And it's different from, let's say, opening a Walmart in your town, right? The book looks a lot about economic development and what these private prison corporations, how they've been used to increase economic development in small towns all across the country. I spent some time in Appleton, Minnesota for the book, where they built a prison hoping that it would save the town's economy, and for a short time it did. before it sort of imploded. And that is what I think really doesn't sit well with people. And this is different from opening a widget factory or a Walmart in your town. You are opening a facility that is there to make money off of people who are behind bars.
I think that in the book, you there's a line, or maybe more than a line, where you compare it to slavery in a way, right? Because it's people making money off of people who are in captivity. And that when I read that, I felt like that really drilled down to the nub of it, to me at least. That it, that there's a sort of implicit comparison that people make in their minds when they hear that all this money is being made off of people who are in cages.
Well, and I think the reason that people analogize this to slavery, whether it's incarceration or private prisons coming in and profiting off of incarceration, is because the incentive structure. And when I talk about the incentive structure, these corporations are incentivized to house more and more bodies. And in this research, I spoke to a lot of directors of corrections, a lot of private prison officials. I read a lot of historical research. And when we talk about moving incarcerated individuals around between government prisons and private prisons, I think the language is really telling. And a lot of the language is shipment of inmates. We are busing a shipment of inmates to a private prison in Vermont. In the 1980s and early 1990s, there was a newsletter that these really smart entrepreneurs decided to put out, and it was a company that matched up incarcerated individuals with available beds. And it's like the way Craigslist is today. All of these corrections officers and sheriffs would get this newsletter and know how to move, where they could move different individuals. And that's what happens a lot with the private prisons, is that, for example, I spoke to a lot of incarcerated individuals in Vermont who were literally bused out of Vermont, some of them 12-hour bus rides down to Michigan and Kentucky to private prisons where their families couldn't visit them because it was too expensive.
And did they feel differently about their captivity than people who are serving time in public prisons that you've spoken to? Like, do they feel a special anguish for being in the system?
That's a really interesting question. And when I interviewed a lot of incarcerated individuals for the book, a lot of them told me that their time in these facilities was not that different from their time in the public facilities. And some of them even said, I preferred my time in these private facilities. Two of the individuals I interviewed said, well, I have my Xbox. I have an iPod. I wasn't allowed to have those in the state institution. And here, there are less correctional officers. They don't mind as much. When I spoke to a lot of people who were incarcerated in private prisons while I was writing the book, and they said, I don't want to go back to the state facility. And I thought that was really interesting. And then with every single person who I spoke with, especially the ones who said that, my time here is not so bad, I said, well, let me play devil's advocate. You're in a private prison. Does it bother you? What do you think about this? And, I detail this in the book, but every single person to a T who I spoke with said, I get ill when I think someone is making money off of my incarceration, my pain. A couple of people I spoke to said, what does this say about America? What does this say about our values that someone has found a way to make money off the fact that I violated the criminal code? And that's very telling. While I wrestled with these ideas a lot when I was writing the book, even if these prisons do save a little bit of money, even if some of these facilities may not be that different from public facilities, what does it mean that we're making money off of putting people behind bars?
Yeah. So clearly you spoke to incarcerated individuals who are serving time in these places. You got access to these facilities. I'm curious, when you started the book, what did you think what kind of access did you think you would need to be able to answer the questions you wanted to answer? And what kind of access did you get? And how hard was it to get?
It was really hard. So jails and prisons in this country are pretty big. They're big black boxes. There's so much that we don't know about that happens behind bars. When we talk about private prisons, they're even more black boxes. And I detail this in the book. I tried really, really hard to get into these prisons. I eventually did, but it was not through the private prison corporations themselves. And I think that's really telling because they're not open systems. And
How did you get in?
so that's a great question. The way I got in was through the government. So I would call up the director of correction in Colorado, in New Mexico, in Louisiana, and I asked to get into different prisons, and they said, no problem. Come down, you let me know, and we'll make it possible. And that's how I got into those prisons. I also tried to get into immigrant detention centers through the private prisons, Geo Group and Core Civic, the two biggest private prison corporations. When I realized that wasn't going to happen, so I visited a couple of detention centers that were privatized under the Obama administration, and I got in through ICE. So at the end of the day, every single private prison facility I ever gained access to was through state government or the federal government. It was not through these corporations. And that's pretty telling. I had a lot of email exchanges, phone conversations with the PR folks at these corporations. I sent a long list at one point, and I said, please answer these questions. How have you innovated? What are your best facilities? What are you proud of? They never got back to me.
Yeah, right.
Yes. I was making it
Brag
easy.
for me, yeah.
Yes. They never got back to me.
That makes me wonder, actually, do the private prisons who, on a certain level, answer to the Department of Corrections in their state, what is the relationship between the government and those private prisons? Is there like a tension there? Do they see them as a client, or what did you find?
So that's why. So this is actually leads me to an interesting story. The corporations are pretty beholden to state government and federal government because government provides the contracts. So there are a lot of lobbyists in the states and at the federal level. A lot of them are former government corrections folks who now work for private industry. And the private industry needs the government, right? Without these government contracts, they would not exist. So when I visited Colorado, I went down Director Ramish, who's the head of corrections there, who sort of made national headlines for locking himself in solitary confinement as soon as he became corrections chief in Colorado. To prove that solitary confinement does not work. And he wrote an op-ed for the New York Times, and he described how horrific that it was only a few hours, and he went, he really went crazy. And people are locked in solitary for 24 hours. So very passionate director of corrections, and he invited me in, said, whatever you want to see, I'll show you. So we showed up at this private prison, Crowley Correctional Facility on the border of Colorado and New Mexico, tiny town, maybe 1,500 people live there. And lo and beholden, the CEO of Core Civic and a couple of PR people and other people who worked for him greeted me in the large conference room of this private prison. I think they were worried that the director of corrections in Colorado was thinking twice about using private prisons, and at the time there were 6 or 7 in the state. So they're pretty beholden to government.
You mentioned a second ago one specific institution that you spent a lot of time researching in Appleton, Minnesota. Tell me about how that prison came to exist and where its origins kind of fit into the history of private prisons in America, or at least the recent history of private prisons in America.
So Appleton, Minnesota is 3 hours west of St. Paul. It's on the border of South Dakota, a very small town. And I visited Appleton because there's a private prison in Appleton that has a really interesting history. It was found, it sort of broke ground in 1992, and a city manager at the time who had absolutely no corrections experience, no criminal justice background, he was the city manager of this tiny town, wanted to do something to improve the economy of this tiny town. It was the early 90s. The town was hit really hard by the recession. The agricultural community had moved out of the town, and he tried to bring different industries to the town. He tried to bring a casino at one point. Everybody turned him down, and he was reading about how prisons were overcrowded, and he was right. In the mid 1980s, two-thirds of prisons, two-thirds of states were under some sort of federal court order to reduce their correctional population for violating the U.S. Constitution. Prisons were unhygienic, they were unsafe, they were dirty, people were escaping them. And so he'd been reading that there weren't enough prisons in the United States. And he said, well, maybe I'll bring a prison to this town. And
it's not that different from a casino.
Exactly. I mean, it was sort of the fifth on his list of things. And he called, he said he called a lawyer in the big city and said, I want to bring a prison to Appleton. And they said, are you crazy? And he said, no, I'm telling you, it's going to make money. And
create jobs.
And he wrote up a proposal, and he somehow got the financing, and they built this prison. And literally in the middle of a soybean field in 1992. And they didn't have any incarcerated individuals to fill the prison.
For like months, right? After it.
For years.
Sorry.
And then he got a call from the director of corrections of the state who said, I just got off the phone with Puerto Rico, and they don't have enough facilities for their incarcerated population. Would you take them? And this individual, the city manager, said yes. And he flew down to Puerto Rico, met with their corrections folks, and within a couple of weeks, they flew Puerto Rican inmates to Appleton.
I remember when I read that part of the book, and you note that like the staff had to be very quickly instructed in Spanish so they could communicate with these people. And it really drove home to me like the arrogance that you would have to think that you could just like run a prison. Like, you know what I mean? Like, where does a person like that get the confidence to think he would know how to run a facility like that? It's really extraordinary to me.
It is extraordinary. And this gentleman, the city manager, when I was interviewing him, said if I had so eventually they did attract incarcerated individuals to fill the prison. And he said if I had $1 for every city manager and mayor who called me and asked how they could set up a prison in their town, he said I'd be a rich man today.
Probably a pretty rich man anyway.
Yeah, but it's pretty wild that and I think it does show the gumption, but at the heart of it is the profit motive that we in this country have used incarceration in terms of economic development, just as if prison is a Walmart or a hamburger stand, and that's sort of the heart of it. And the story of the prison eventually is that Core Civic, one of the largest private prison corporations in the country, bought it, was able to expand it. The town sort of had a couple years of, they were able to build another gas station, restaurant, a Super 8 motel, but eventually when states started to reduce their prison populations, the prison closed, and the reason Appleton's such a centerpiece of the book is that it's sort of this microcosm of what happens all across the country. There's sort of Appletons everywhere. Hardin, Montana has a really similar story. They try to encourage incarcerated individuals or, people from Guantanamo to come to their prison. And it's this story that's told over and over again in this country, that prisons are really this source of economic development, or that's what people think they are. And that's where we are today, right? We have mass incarceration because of our policies, but this idea of making money off of those who are behind bars really encouraged mass incarceration.
So actually, that's a nice segue into my next question to you, which is, there is this conventional wisdom that private prisons are sort of a centerpiece of mass incarceration. There's an idea that if we got rid of them, like, that would be a really important step towards ending mass incarceration. How do you evaluate that notion? And I guess, how would you characterize the role of private prisons in the debate over how to curtail mass incarceration?
So I love that question because they are intertwined, and then the book explores what is the relationship between the profit motive and mass incarceration. And a lot of people advocate to eliminate private prisons, to eliminate all of the profit motive in incarceration. And we cannot start de-incarcerating in this country. We cannot significantly reduce our prison populations until we get the profit motive out of incarceration. The problem is that while we have these private prisons, while we have so many corporations that need sort of this captive population to make money, we're going to have a really hard time reducing prison populations. But they're not the sole cause of mass incarceration. And I do think a lot of people blame the private prison industry for creating mass incarceration, and the numbers just don't bear that out. We have 2.2 million people behind bars, about I have some Brennan Center folks here who know the statistics better than I do. 700,000 people around, in jail. We have about 200,000 people at the federal level in the Bureau of Prisons, and about 1.5 million people in state prisons. So it's a complicated system, but I think without the private prison industry, we would have less people incarcerated for sure. And one of the reasons I say that is because in the 1980s, when we started down the road towards mass incarceration, when the private prison industry sort of came to the rescue of all of these states who were faced with raising taxes and building more prisons. All they had to do was say to these private prisons, take this overflow population.
It was like a safety valve,
it
right?
was a safety valve, and I think without that safety valve, policymakers would have been able to have those tough conversations, which they never really had in the 1980s when they needed to, about what to do with so many people who violated the criminal code and whether they should be in prison in the first place.
In other words, if private prisons hadn't made it easy for policymakers to just keep doing what they were doing, perhaps they would have done something different, and we would have seen the prison population start to fall instead of continue to go up.
I think we would have had more conversations, the conversations that we're having now at the state and federal level about whether alternatives to incarceration for so many people who break laws are a better use of taxpayer money and make more sense than sending people to jails and prisons for so long. And those conversations weren't had, and I think a real reason they weren't had was because the private prison industry sort of very quickly entrenched itself in American corrections.
I got a couple more. If people have questions to ask, please get them ready. One thing that's really striking about your book, and actually Kierkegaard, I think, noted this in the review of the book, that it's very even-handed. It's very sort of almost like aggressively even-handed is the wrong word, but like you really go out of your way to be like, I want to understand if these places are as bad as one assumes, and I want to understand whether they're actually worse than state facilities or federal facilities. Did that kind of open-mindedness, that even-handedness, earn you any kind of like pushback from like the advocacy community? Did you find that made it harder for you to, get the reporting done that you needed to get done, or easier?
I think it opened doors because I really went in with a very open mind is not the right phrase, but I wanted to find out why the people who work at these private prisons, I wanted to find out whether there was any innovation there. I wanted to find out if they were trying to sort of beat government recidivism rates and see what I could uncover. And I spoke to a lot of people, some of them on the record, some of them off the record, who I think wouldn't have spoken to me if they thought I was just, drawing conclusions right away, advocating to abolish private prisons, abolish all private industry. The book ultimately makes recommendations to improve the industry. So I do think that was helpful because I could interview incarcerated individuals, their families, formerly incarcerated individuals. Mayors would speak to me, directors of corrections, even some officials who worked for the private industry did end up speaking to me. Even some lobbyists ended up speaking to me. But in terms of the advocacy community, I did receive some pushback. And I write about it in the book because there's some very smart, very passionate advocates, some of whom are formerly incarcerated, who spent hours on the phone with me saying, this is like slavery. How can you write a book that does anything but eliminate the industry? And the book notes that we are living in a world where the private prison industry will not be eliminated tomorrow, next week. The Trump administration is certainly relying on the private prison industry even more so than the Obama administration did. And I think that it's unrealistic to only advocate to eliminate the industry without saying there are tens of thousands of people who are behind bars in private prisons and private immigration detention centers today. And we need to improve conditions of confinement. We need to reduce recidivism rates. We need to make life better. We need to have better transparency and know what's happening behind bars while people are incarcerated in these private facilities. And so I think we need a multi-pronged approach.
You mentioned Trump, of course.
Who?
Well, actually, is this the anniversary? I guess this is the anniversary of our new reality. He obviously, his administration has a very different point of view on private prisons than the previous one did, and the use of private prisons to house immigrants has, as I understand it, really already in this very, very long year, has already ballooned. Can you tell us about how the Trump administration is using private facilities to basically facilitate their policy goals on immigration?
So under the Obama administration, it was pretty late under the Obama administration, but Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates wrote this memo to the Bureau of Prisons asking them to stop relying on private prisons at the federal level, and she cited an Inspector General's report that noted a lot of safety concerns and conditions of confinement concerns at private prisons at the federal level. And this was in August of 2015, and the next day their stocks tanked, and people were writing, this is the end of the private prison industry. And then DHS, under the Obama administration, started to examine their use of private prisons, which is actually much greater than even DOJ's use of private prisons. And when Trump was elected, almost immediately, Attorney General Sessions sent a one-paragraph memo, or very few sentences in this memo, to the Bureau of Prisons, asking them to continue to rely on the private prison industry, and it's at the federal level, it's about 18% of incarcerated individuals are in private prisons in the federal system. But what a lot of people don't know is that we have essentially privatized immigration detention in this country. Today, as we sit here, about 65% of immigration detention beds are privatized, and most of those are in facilities owned by Geo Group, CoreCivic, and this company, MTC.
These are immigrants who have been convicted of crimes?
No. Well, it's a technical question. So these are undocumented citizens who are not legally in this country. Some of these citizens who I interviewed in the book, these are civil detainees who are in these immigration detention centers. Some of them literally walked across the border, went into Border Patrol house, put their hands up and said, "I'm seeking asylum." So we can have technical. ICE will tell you they violated the law, they crossed the border, they're not supposed to be here. These are people who have not been convicted of a crime for the most part. Some of them will eventually get asylum. And these are civil detainees, and when you walk around these immigration detention centers, they look, feel, smell like prisons. And people are not free to go. They are triple bunked, watching television all day long. They're not required to provide any programming at all. They're paid $1 a day to sweep floors or fold laundry. And in terms of Trump, we are definitely headed towards more privatized immigration detention. We've already started to see that they've given some contracts in Texas to private prison corporations to build new facilities. And last week, Department of Homeland Security put out some pre-request for proposals to contractors who have capacity to house immigrant detainees in the southwest border, but sort of what's unprecedented is they're actually trying to build immigration detention centers or immigration detention jails in the interior of the country for the first time ever. So I think that's a harbinger of things to come.
Yep. Should we take some questions?
Great. Sure.
Hi. You'd mentioned a little bit about lobbying, and I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the private prison lobby and the impacts they've had on things like the war on drugs, 3 strikes in California, and whether, in fact, that has increased the populations in private prisons.
So there are lobbyists who work for these big corporations at the state level, at the federal level. And it's interesting because when I started researching this book, I spoke to a lot of former directors of corrections, and I said to one of them, where are they powerful? And he said, you're not going to find some sort of smoking gun. They're powerful in this one state or this one part of the country. He said they're powerful in the margins, right? They're powerful when they show up at state legislatures and educate state policymakers on bills. The book does trace that members of CoreCivic and Geo Group were certainly on these criminal justice task forces in the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, meetings in the 90s and early 2000s. And they were instrumental in actually writing some laws that ALEC then shopped around to states across the country, one of them being 3 strikes laws. They've also been instrumental in working with ALEC and other state legislators on drafting some laws that would increase immigration enforcement, that would obviously sort of line their pocketbooks. And the book looks at where they've been powerful and where this happens. And it's funny because when I was doing research on Geo Group's website and CoreCivic's website, they were very quick to write, we do not lobby. We educate state policymakers. We educate federal policymakers. And you can go look up, all of the lobbying activity. But it's pretty powerful. I mean, they're getting more creative now about how they do so because, the press is reporting about it.
What percentage would you say of the prison population in this country are political prisoners? And by political prisoners, I mean people who are considered public enemies of the United States government?
It's a really interesting question. That wasn't covered in the book as much. Most of the people who are incarcerated in this country are, believe it or not, low-level drug people have committed drug offenses, nonviolent crimes. In terms of political prisoners, I'm just not quite sure, what those statistics are. But in terms of the research that we do at the Brennan Center, it's usually crimes such as drug offenses, robbery, burglary. But I mean, it's a great question.
Just first to address that last question, you could watch a film called If a Tree Falls by Marshall Curry, which gets into domestic terrorism among environmentalists who've been incarcerated. Those are the kind of political prisoners that you might see, or Mumia al-Jubar, if that's what you're referring to. My question is, I have many, but the first one I'd like to lead with is when in usual state-funded jails and prisons, those who are found guilty and adjudicated are given some kinds of psychological and sociological tests. They're interviewed before usually being deployed into a facility. 1 out of 4 are estimated to have mental health issues. I'm wondering what kind of pre-screening is done for the private facilities, and if they try to screen out those who might be deemed as mentally ill and difficult.
That's a really great question. And the way it tends to work in terms of who's in a government facility or a private facility is that, it's not so clean, right? So that's why when you talk to directors of corrections, and even if you talk to the private prison officials, one of the recommendations in the book is these private corporations need to start examining and reporting about their recidivism rates. And the pushback is, well, we don't know because they're in a state facility for a year and then we have them for 6 months and then they go back to a state facility. That's wrong. You actually can figure that out even if people move between facilities. But in terms of mental health screening, all of that would be done by the state first, and then a decision is made. No one would. It's very rare that you would go straight to a private prison. Usually, what happens is you may be at, some kind of a prison for a few months, and then get sent to a private prison. And what's interesting is that we as in defense of the private prison industry, we've asked them to do something very difficult, which is save a lot of taxpayer money, but also, provide safe, secure facilities and rehabilitate people. And one of the ways that the private prison industry has been able to be so profitable in that situation is that they ensure in their contracts, in most cases, that they have a population of incarcerated individuals who are very low security threat, who don't have a lot of mental health or medical issues, because it's very expensive to house individuals who have a lot of medical needs or mental health needs, or if you're high security risk, you need to have more correctional officers. So the private prisons, for the most part, tend to have very sort of the healthier, less risky incarcerated people.
So I actually have 2 questions, and apologies. But I guess my first question is, everyone in this room, I think, is already, clued in to private prisons, period. And I would assume, actually, that a majority of Americans aren't even necessarily aware of private prisons' existence. So I was curious if you could touch on the awareness of the private prison industry and what that spectrum looks like. Especially because I imagine that, if not a majority, a minority of Americans are maybe even familiar with this concept due to a popular Netflix television show.
Yeah.
And then my second question was if you could touch on, rehabilitation, reentry programs compared private prison versus public, both dismal, I'm sure, but curious.
Great question. So the show you're referring to is Orange is the New Black, I assume. And a really interesting anecdote about that show. So for those of you who are not familiar with Orange is the New Black, I think the second, third, fourth season focus on a private prison taking over the prison where all of the characters are. And I spoke to someone, actually an analyst who covers the private prison industry, who told me that the Hillary Clinton campaign was polling millennials about lots of different issues, and they're very aware of the private prison industry because of Orange is the New Black. And this is a group of individuals who probably wouldn't have been aware of that industry but for that show. And that's likely one of the reasons why Hillary Clinton gave back all the campaign donations she received from CoreCivic and Geo Group, because there was a lot of pressure on her from millennials and Black Lives Matter. And so I do think that show has, certainly when I talk to people about the issue, they say, oh, right, there was Orange is the New Black, had private prisons. I think it sort of popularized this idea that a corporation can come in and take over a facility, which is what happens. And then your second question was about rehabilitation and programming. That's something that the book examines as well. And a lot of these prisons that are privatized have less programming, less rehabilitation. And part of that reason is because they need to save money. And programs are really expensive. And now a lot of programs that even exist have to be what's called evidence-based programs. And those are really expensive and hard to run. And that's something, even when I spoke to incarcerated individuals in these facilities, a lot of them said, there's not a lot of programming here. And that's something that I felt too when I visited these prisons. And, immigration detention centers are required to have no programming. I mean, these are civil detainees. So.
Hi, my question's about access. You mentioned talking to some of the prisoners, and I just wondered if you could say a bit more about how prisoners were selected that you spoke to, and like what kind of access and freedom to speak with them that you had.
That's a really great question. I spoke to anyone who I could. So I'm not a sociologist or I don't have a PhD, and I just sort of pounded the pavement and, what a journalist would do. Tried to get connections to as many people as I could who would speak to me. I wrote letters to some incarcerated individuals. I opened a JPay account, so I'm part of the prison industrial complex, and I, you pay 50 cents to email someone who's in prison, and then you can include a stamp so that they don't have to pay to email you back. I spoke on the phone with a lot of incarcerated individuals, which was really hard because they only have certain times of day when they can speak, or they have access to the phone, or if they have any sort of disciplinary violation, they're not given phone access. I spoke to a lot of formerly incarcerated individuals, and just asked around and spoke to advocates in the field and people I knew who had been incarcerated or who knew other people who were incarcerated. Some of the people who I was corresponding with via email said, oh, you have to talk to my friend, here's his email, and so some of the incarcerated individuals introduced me to their friends. But access was pretty hard. I would email someone and a month would go by before I'd hear back from them. Or they'd, it's really, that part of it was really hard. I also was able to speak to a lot of families of incarcerated individuals, which was also helpful too, and it sort of shed light on how difficult and expensive it was to communicate with their loved ones who were behind bars as well.
LB.
I work with Jay at the Brennan Center.
I was thinking about this as you were talking to incarcerated people and talking about kind of profiting off of breaking the criminal code. And I started thinking more about like JPay and Airmark, some of these other corporations. And it's not something we usually talk about, this kind of profit. Do you find this kind of profit as problematic? And should we be working hard to either eliminate that or regulate that? Or do you think the incentive structures for someone like JPay or Airmark or whoever gives the clothes to prisoners, that stuff, is that different, or is that part of the same story that we just don't really talk about?
I think that's a great question. I think it's part of the prison industrial complex, which is no one really knows how big the prison industrial complex is because some of these companies are not public. It's very, very hard to calculate all of the profit that is made off of incarcerated individuals. But some corporations like JPay, for example, there are other corporations that are sort of technology-based that provide a lot of email services, video conferencing services, even tablets to incarcerated individuals. They will pay the state a certain percentage of their profit. So that incentive structure doesn't make any sense, right? That's incentivizing more people behind bars. And so when you sort of peel back the layers of the onion and look at how these corporations are making money and how they're getting the contracts, it's really problematic. On top of that, these fees are really high. And so, if you go on JPay's website, for example, you can find out how much it would cost to send money to a loved one behind bars. And it's about, they charge about a $10 commission for $150 or more. Video visitation can be upwards of $15. So they're making a lot of money off of, people who are really poor. I mean, most people who are incarcerated in this country are indigent. Their families are indigent. And these companies have found a way to make money off of the poorest people in our society. So I think it's a huge part of the problem. And I think when we talk about the privatization of justice, it's so much bigger than these private prison corporations. It's really this sort of entrenched capitalism that's intertwined with mass incarceration.
We have time for just a couple more questions if anyone has some. Here we go.
Hey, LB.
Hi, Dorian.
So I'm going to borrow your book, Julia. So first, the cover of your book is very interesting. So I wanted to know if there was like a story behind it. So if you could kind of clue us in as to, why you picked this particular cover.
That's great. So my editor, Stephen, is sitting in the front row.
Hi, Stephen.
And Stephen had a lot to do with that. And it's funny, when I saw the cover, I actually didn't understand it immediately. So, what? Yeah. So we can hold it up. It's sort of a Rorschach test. But it's I think a really creative cover. So the thank you. So the bars are prison bars. These are barcodes, which I actually didn't get at first. And then these are tickers. So if one's in solitary confinement or in prison, you count the days by, using your finger to sort of carve out every day, every year you spend behind bars. So I thought that was really creative. Three. So I did not pass the IQ test when I first saw the cover, but a lot of other really smart people who were sitting in this room did. And orange for most people in prison do wear orange jumpsuits.
And then I had one more question.
Yes.
So you were talking about the RFIs that went out requesting for different prisons to kind of bid to kind of house immigrant detainees. What implications does that have, like being that like the Trump administration is so focused on immigration that like 4 of these RFIs went out in sanctuary cities?
Oh, that's such a good question. So what Ajari is referring to is that very recently DHS put out, I've never seen this before, perhaps it's common, a pre-request for proposal, request for information it was called, to contractors who could house immigrant detainees in what are called the interior part of the country. So it was St. Paul, Chicago, I think St. Louis. It was cities that are not border cities. And that's pretty rare. Right? One, it shows that we're likely ramping up immigration detention all across the country, not just sort of the South, Texas, Arizona, California, where these private immigration detention centers line the whole Southwest border. And they happen to also be sanctuary cities. One could connect the dots that perhaps the government is bearing down on cities that, sanctuary cities, or these cities that decided not to take some of this federal money because their local police officers have decided not to enforce immigration laws for some very good reasons. So it's perhaps a nod to these sanctuary cities that the Trump administration is not very happy with them.
Thank you for
Yes.
coming.
And thank
Leon,
you
thank
all
you so
for
much.
coming and asking these questions.